In the 10th century emerged one of the most powerful countries of medieval Europe, Rus. Stretching from Lake Ladoga to the shores of the Black Sea, it was a conglomerate of cities and tribes, connected by inland waterways, and ruled from the metropol of Kiev. Owing to the prominence of this city, the history books often call the dominion the Kievan Rus. This is of course a historiographic convenience, implemented in order to distinguish a certain place during a certain period of time. Naming conventions of this state are steeped in controversy, owing to the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, both of whom look to this state as their foundation, and seek to use this history to legitimize their political goals. In period documents, the medieval Kievan state referred to itself as Rus, or the Ruskaya Zemlya. Zemlya means land, and Ruskaya was the adjective form for something of, from, or related to Rus. For example, the legal code Ruskaya Pravda. What territories were included under the name of Rus has been disputed. Rus appears to have originated between the lakes Ladoga and Ilmen in the 9th century, but by the height of Rus, it seems to have referred to the capital heartland surrounding Kiev. By proxy, it came to include all of the territories controlled by the Kievan Principality. Thus, when the Kievan Principality lost control over these other territories, the name of Rus appears to have still been used to refer to the entire territory in some contexts, most often abroad, but sometimes even domestically. A chronicle might speak of an epidemic troubling the entire Rus land. However, documents differentiated between the territories of the different principalities. They call themselves Tverskaya Zemlya, Suzdalskaya Zemlya, most importantly the Novgorodskaya Zemlya. Despite being the original capital of Rus, Novgorod never made any claims to the title of Rus. Other principalities did. Both Galicia Volhynia and later Moscow, both of whom had ambitious aspirations, used the name Ruskaya Zemlya in reference to their own territories. The Moscow Principality would eventually absorb the entire Rus territory and over the centuries rebrand itself as the inheritor of the old state. Moscow likewise viewed itself as the inheritor of the fallen Byzantine Empire, a third Rome, partly due to a dynastic connection to the Byzantines, and would call itself Rossiya, after the medieval Greek designation for Rus, Rossias, Latinized as Russia in the 11th century. The modern English spelling first appeared in the 12th century, where Latin sources also called it Ruthenia. The medieval situation can be compared to a fictional scenario in the United States, where the states would all become independent. Individuals would identify themselves by their state, as would legal documents. But abroad, the wider region would be recognized as America, or even the US, and if a famine would strike the entire region, even internally you'd speak of a famine in America. A more grounded comparison could be made to Germany. The Kingdom of Germany existed as a title in the Middle Ages. German existed as a loose identity, but the country was divided between many semi-independent states. The medieval polity was obviously quite different from the Prussian Germany, which was very different from the modern, unified Germany, but all of them made claims to the old legacy. To foreigners, it was only official documents which recognized the autonomy of individual principalities. This can be evidenced in diplomatic dealings between Tver and Byzantium, and Novgorod and Sweden. In the late Middle Ages, in a letter between the Prince of Tver and Emperor of Byzantium, the latter recognized the former as ruler of the Tverian lands. But when Tverian delegates visited Byzantium, they were referred to as belonging to the Rus land. In late medieval and early modern Sweden, Novgorodians and any Slavic speakers from the former Rus territory, called Ryssland, was called a Rus, plural Ryssar. But official documents such as peace treaties recognize them as Novgorodian. Ryssland is still the Scandinavian name for Russia. The earliest written use I've found of Ryssland stems from the 13th century Gutha saga, where it is called Rysaland, Rusland, or Land of the Rus. Before then, during the Viking Age, Scandinavians seem to have called the territory Garthariki, Land of Garthur, Garthur meaning a fortified settlement. I hope that clears out some of the confusion. The Middle Ages are complicated, and nations as we know them today did not exist. Other peoples saw the Rus as a single country and people. At some points it was a single country ruled by a prince with subordinate princes below him. More often than not, these princes fought in bloody civil wars or exercised great autonomy, eventually independence. They often paid tribute and had vassal obligations to neighboring nomads, most prominently the Mongols. Aside from the nomads, this was largely the norm in the European Middle Ages. Culturally speaking, a unified sort of identity did emerge by the end of the 12th century, paradoxically when Rus was the most fragmentary. As Simon Franklin put it in his book, Emergence of the Rus, there was no state, but perhaps they were the beginnings of a nation. Ethnically, it is even more complicated. The most controversial debate is whether Rus was originally founded by Slavs or Scandinavians, who had a definite presence in the state as diplomats, mercenaries, traders, and craftsmen. The Scandinavians never made up a significant part of the population, which wasn't entirely Slavic. The north and east were inhabited by Finno-Ugrians, the west and upper Dnieper by Balts. Nor was there a single group of unified Slavs, but various tribes with different identities, and even Western Slavic colonists from modern Germany and Poland. Even Turkic nomads were able to swear allegiance and become part of the Rus land. What I'm trying to say is that the deeper you dive into this history, the more complicated it becomes and the truth more elusive, to the point where it can be argued that it doesn't really exist. Basing your entire modern national identity, beliefs or politics upon stuff which happened 1,000 years ago in a time poorly documented by an upper class with ulterior motives is bound to end in disappointment, and frankly I find it silly. No people today can rightfully claim to be the true single inheritors of the original Rus. Cities have been destroyed and rebuilt too many times, people moved around and intermingled, and judging purely by language, no one speaks the old Slavonic tongue anymore. Instead, it branched out over the years and eventually developed into the modern languages of Belarusian, Russian, Rusin, Ukrainian, etc. I think instead it should be taken with a pinch of salt and enjoyed for what it is. Cool guys in armor bashing each other. It doesn't really have to be any more complicated. If you think that its history can be used to justify politics and conquest and genocide or whatever, sure, pretty much anything can be if you have the mind to do so. Humans are pretty good at finding or not finding an excuse to kill and abuse each other. In the end, I'm just here to enjoy the cool history, and I hope you are as well. I've spoken a lot about Rus, states and principalities, but the region at its very beginning was much more simple. Northern Rus was especially inhospitable. Wide tracts of swamp and forest, roamed by wild predators and blood-sucking insects. Settlements were relegated to relatively unambitious hill forts and farming communities, controlled by local tribes. The northern regions were inhabited by various Finno-Ugric peoples and a number of northern Slavs. Balts lived deeper into what is now Belarus, and the south was entirely Slavic, bar the presence of horse nomads, the Magyars, and the more powerful Khazar Khanate, a semi-nomadic empire stretching from the lower Dnipro to the Caspian Sea, where they ruled from the capital of Atil. Subordinate to Khazaria was the Khanate of Volga Bulgaria, who operated as a prominent trader of Slavo-Finnic slaves. Indeed, the whole region had been a thriving trade network since ancient times, possibly the Neolithic. Merchants traveled by ski and sled during winter, and in summer by crude boats upon the innumerable rivers, pulsing through the continent like so many veins. The oldest network seems to have connected the Baltic to the Ural Mountains, but by the first millennium was primarily focused on the Mediterranean and Caspian seas. Exports primarily included furs, honey, beeswax and slaves, but to a lesser extent flax, hemp, tow, burlap, hops and sheepskin. In return we received luxury goods like wine, silk, spices, precious stones and art. Early commerce was especially prominent in the lower Dnipro around Kiev, whereas the northern reaches were more poor. This can be evidenced in the excavations of native graves of the Sopka culture around Lake Ilmen, which seldom contained any finer items than handmade pottery, the occasional glass beads. In the late 8th century, the Khazars made peace with the Islamic Caliphate, allowing for the flow of northern furs to the Fertile Crescent. In return, the northerners received silver dirham. Silver was a universally recognized currency, and was of special value in Eastern Europe and the Baltic, where it wasn't mined yet. The appearance of silver seems to have first drawn the attention of the Western Baltic Slavs, the Wends, who had opened up a trade link between the island of Rügen and Lake Ladoga in the 8th century. A trading settlement called Aldeigjuborg had been established here in the previous decades, but it's uncertain by whom. Evidence points to the presence of Slavs, Finns, and Norsemen. Indeed, Norse tradesmen, primarily from Gotland and Middle Sweden, had been active fur traders since the height of Rome. Archaeology points to their presence in the eastern Baltic between the migration period and early Viking Age, and eventually they began extorting tribute from the Balts and Estonians, even establishing a few colonies in modern Latvia and Poland. In a study of the appearance of silver dirham in the 8th and 9th centuries, Thomas Noonan concluded that the initial flow of silver was between northern Russia and the southern Baltic coast, but that it soon began trickling into Gotland and Middle Sweden. Jan Zach proposed that Frisians and Gotlanders served as the first intermediaries in the Wendish silver trade. Multiple written sources, both later and contemporary, point to a close connection between the Wends and Norsemen, in the form of intermarriage, alliances, and even joint settlements in what is now Denmark and Germany. Superior shipbuilding allowed the Norsemen to make forays beyond Ladoga, down the rivers and into the southern empires. The expansion of Aldeigjuborg would lead to the cropping up of similar market and craft centers in the vicinity. By the 9th century, these settlements appear to have been controlled by a mysterious Kievan Rus. I already have a separate video discussing the Rus Kievan in depth, so a shorter version will be retold here. The Kievan certainly appears to have been Rus and not a Turk, but the title and other cultural connections hints at an alliance or subordination to the Khazar Khaganate, likely in return for letting the Rus manage the northern fur trade. An alternate hypothesis states that the nomadic customs were adopted in order to usurp the Khazar's position as the overlord of regional trade. While most empires are interested in the expansion of land and agriculture, early Rus was limited in size, and the Rus Khagan seemingly dedicated to ruthlessly maintaining its trade network. Arabic visitors speak of the Rus raiding their neighbors for slaves. Indeed, historians often consider the early Rus to have been a sort of trade company, seemingly not unlike the East India companies of the early modern age, who often behaved piratically. Hostility was likely supplemented by extortion and peaceful trade. The Khagan likewise had the power to attack the city of Constantinople, possibly even Spain. His diplomatic connections reached to the Byzantine Empire, but his identity has never been resolved. He could have been a Norseman. They were the prime intermediaries in the trade network and had the best ships. He could have been a Wend. They were the ones who started the silver trade. He could even have been a Finn or a local Slav who adapted foreign elements, but was still used to dealing and trading with the Khazars. The most radical theory would say that he was a Frisian. The origins of the Rus state were explained in the Tale of Bygone Years, a medieval chronicle written down almost 300 years after the fact. According to the Chronicle, it was in 859 that Varangians began extorting tribute from the tribes around Ladoga and Ilmen. Most people take Varangians to mean Scandinavians exclusively, but it seems to have been used for any inhabitants of the Baltic Sea, called the Varangian Sea. In 862 the tribes expelled their suzerains, only to end up fighting among themselves, and deciding to invite Varangians to govern over them. Specifically, a group of Varangians called the Rus. The homeland of these original Rus remains uncertain. Normanist consensus draws a connection to Roslagen, a coastal province of Middle Sweden, known as Ruden on an 11th century runestone. It is believed that Rutsi, the word for Swedes in several Finnic languages, comes from this region. The theory goes that Rutsi would have developed into the word Rus. However, anti-Normanists think the Rus were Wends, the Baltic Slavs. In multiple medieval sources, the Rus are known as Rugis, a Wendish tribe from the island of Rügen. Archaeology and DNA research points to the prominence of both. In reality, it seems like Rus began as an artificial identity, a multi-ethnic conglomerate of merchants and warriors, incorporating any of the ethnic groups wishing to partake in their affairs. According to the Chronicle, 3 brothers were chosen to be governors: Rurik, Cineus, and Truvor. But only Rurik survived, and ruled as the sole king of the nascent Rus, its capital in Novgorod at Lake Ilmen. No other source but the Chronicle describes Rurik, so his identity and existence has been contested. He might have been based on an important prince, or simply served as an allegory to explain a more complicated historical process. Either way, archaeology shows that his capital at Ilmen was established no later than the mid-9th century. In the 970s, both it and Ladoga were torched, and afterwards expanded. So there was turmoil and a return of order, meaning that the Chronicle contains at least some grain of truth. Indeed, it seems as though a shift was necessary, away from the more ruthless conduct of the early Khaganate. The Rus state of the turn of the 9th and 10th centuries seems to have been more interested in state building, the expansion of agriculture and territory, and the more peaceful extortion of tribute in order to gather trade items to sell. Holmgard or Novgorod at Lake Ilmen is a perfect example of the new model settlement. It was fortified from its very inception and ruled by a stratified elite, who controlled the river trade network and received subsistence from agricultural satellite settlements. This can be interpreted as a prototype of the Pogost, a system of fortified settlements for collecting tribute and organizing shipping on the river trade network. The Rus would not only expand existing settlements, but construct new ones. Interestingly, they shifted their interest from the Volga River to the Dnieper in the south, constructing the towns of Gniostava and Kiev. The legend says that Rurik's successor, Oleg, conquered the city of Kiev in 880. According to archaeology, the medieval city of Kiev did not really exist by then, but was founded instead sometime around 887. It seems to have been controlled by the Khazars, so what most likely happened was that the Khazars allowed the Rus to sell at Kiev and expand its trade potential. The hostile Magyars had just begun their migration into the Carpathian Peninsula, opening up the lucrative trade route to Byzantium, which Kiev was perfectly situated to control. Around the same time was established the city of Gniostava, largely inhabited and definitely controlled by Norsemen, whereas Kiev seems to have been almost exclusively a Northern Slavic project. By the mid-10th century, it had become the largest city in the entirety of Rus. Using Kiev as a springboard, the Rus would subjugate the neighboring tribes and gathered a large host to attack Byzantium in 907. Though appearing as a foolhardy raid, their true purpose was to elicit a trade treaty with the empire. This further stimulated the growth of Kiev, which likewise had direct connections to the Caspian via the Dnipro, Black Sea, Don, and Volga. In 930, Alistakri wrote how their king dwells in a town called Kuyaba, most likely the city of Kiev, indicating that it had now become the capital, or at least the equal to Novgorod. Most of the history before the 10th century is largely speculative, based on scattered documents, legends, and archaeology, whereas written sources of Rus from the 10th century are more abundant and clear. It is now that Rus truly emerges as a nation. The 10th century Ruskayan state could be understood as a massive trade endeavor. This is best explained in the Byzantine text, the Administrando Imperio, which illustrates the cyclical nature of the Ruskayan government. Starting in November, the Russian princes, together with their warriors, went off on polyude, meaning rounds, collecting tribute from their vassal tribes. They presumably traveled between them by sled. In April, when the ice broke, the Rus went down to Kiev, where they collected dug-out canoes made by their tributaries, and furnished them with oars and rigging. In June, they sailed down the Dnipro. At the 7 rapids, they portaged their boats, carried them overland on their shoulders, and since all of them traveled together in what was essentially an armed convoy, they provided mutual protection against hostile nomads. At the end of the Dnipro, they mounted masts and sails upon their ships, and sailed peacefully down to Constantinople, where they spent several months trading. Traveling with the Rus was every prince's personal retinue of family members, dignitaries, and especially merchants, often of foreign origin. It was no doubt common for merchants to travel with the convoy for increased safety. Merchants were incredibly important in the Rus government, as attested to by the treaties between Rus and Byzantium, where they are presented as dignitaries. Judging by the listed names, many of them were Scandinavian. By autumn, the convoy had returned to Rus, and the cycle began again. Thus, the Rus government was crude, but organized. The basis of any tribal government was the warlord's ability to pay his warriors, a cynic would say any government, and the Rus warlords acquired this payment by trade, made by selling products taken from tributaries and collected by the warriors. As for the tribes, all of them together outnumbered the Rus, but separate identities prevented them from uniting. So, by having all of the Rus princes and their warriors travel together and visiting each of the tribes in turn, they essentially used divide and conquer. Surely there were even individual tribes which outnumbered the Rus, but the individual tribesman was much less equipped than the average Rus warrior, clad in his chainmail, helmet, shield and axe, and certainly a veteran of many a scrap. By annually visiting each of the tribes, they constantly kept them on their toes, and indirectly informed them of who was in charge. It was a crude system, sure, but preferable to raids, both for the victims and the perpetrators. Raids were still done against non-tributaries, and had been more common in the previous centuries. As for the relation between the Khagan and his subordinate princes, the rulers of the different cities, this relation seems to have been the least of his concerns. There were no civil wars in Rus until 977, no succession crises. It was surprisingly stable. The concern was with keeping the trade flowing, the warriors paid, the tributaries paying. If any of these would become a problem, the entire system would collapse. This happened in 945, when according to the primary chronicle, Igor's retinue had been jealous of the retinue of one Svenald, a very affluent prince, able to provide his warriors with the best of clothes and weaponry. They demanded that Igor pay them more. So when he went on polyudy against the Derevlians, he imposed a much higher tax than usual. The Derevlians were not happy over this, and slew Igor together with his men. They wanted riches. Now they had dirt. One might expect the Derevlians to declare independence, but this was not the case. They actually wished for peace, and tried to marry their ruler to Igor's widow, Olga. Olga responded by marching on the Derevlians and burned their city. It certainly was a ham-handed approach, but in a brutal system of a brutal world, it certainly served the purpose of showing the taxpayers what happened if you opposed the collector. Olga made other efforts to standardize and improve the collection of tribute. She instituted camps and hunting grounds, netting places for catching birds, and instituted set amounts of tribute to be collected. Thus, she introduced both routine and reliability, decreasing the chances of further uprisings, and increasing the amount of treasure. Another issue with the collection of tribute was that Rus was not the only collector in the area. The big cheese had been the Khazars, a semi-nomadic empire ruling from the city of Atil, on the coast of the Caspian Sea. As described previously, the Rus and Khazars had long since had a symbiotic relationship, but in the 10th century it was starting to break down. They had no doubt spent a long while competing for tributaries. This is described in the primary chronicle as occurring as early as the 880s. When the Rus snatched a tributary from the Khazars, they would only impose a lighter tax upon them, in order to keep them loyal to the new order. It has been proposed that the reason for the Rus king adapting the title of Khagan was to ease the transfer of tribute paying from the Khazar Khagan to a new Khagan, the Rus Khagan in this case. So it was a method for the Rus to usurp the Khazars as the trade lord of the region. But it certainly seems as if the Rus themselves were a sort of vassal to the Khagan, most likely paying him tribute. The first sign of hostility came in 913, when the Rus launched an attack on Muslim possessions in the Caspian Sea. This attack had possibly been incited by the Byzantines, whom the Rus had previously signed a treaty with. The attacking fleet would have needed to travel through the Khazarian lands and was greenlit by the Khagan, who was promised a slice of the profits. But when the successful Rus returned, they had been preceded by outrage, and the Khazars, seemingly incited by Muslim envoys, proceeded to betray and massacre the Rus. The survivors managed to escape, but were finished off by the Burtas and Volga Bulgars. The Rus were undoubtedly eager for revenge, but were much too weak at this point to attempt it. However, Khazaria was standing on its last legs. Originally shamanistic, Khazaria had become a religious battleground between Islamic officials, Orthodox missionaries, and even Jewish converts. The religious turmoil led to a lot of instability, which the Rus would come to exploit. Their first attempt came in 941, when the Byzantines incited them to attack the city of Samkarch. Though the attack itself was successful, the Rus were subsequently defeated and forced by the Khazars to attack the Byzantines as revenge. The attack on Byzantium was an utter disaster. This undoubtedly only fueled the vengeful sentiment against the Khazars. The Rus were now divided. The faction led by Igor, the king of Rus, seems to have been more inclined to the Byzantines, and eventually signed a new treaty with them. The other faction, led by Helgu, leaned to the Khazars. They went on a new expedition into the Caspian Sea, seemingly intending to establish a base from which to attack the Byzantines again. But most of them, including Helgu, were slaughtered and the rest expelled. Around the same time as the conflict between Rus and Khazaria was brewing, the flow of Arabic silver which had led to the rise of Rus was dying out. Whether this was a cause or a result of the conflict is uncertain, but it does coincide with the ramping up of trade with Byzantium. By 970, the flow of Arabic silver had stopped completely. The final nail in the Khazarian coffin was Sviatoslav Igorevich, who also represents the final generation of restless and adventurous Rus, before the eventual civilizing of the country. He had his first comeuppance as a young lad, leading the army of his mother, Olga. Allegedly he managed to kill his own horse by accident, and when he ascended to the throne in 964, he immediately set his sights upon the Khazars. The initial interest of his campaign lay in seizing one of their richest tributaries, a Slavic tribe called the Viatici. Soon his campaign extended into Khazaria itself, bringing flame onto the cities of the Caspian coast. After crushing the Khazarian Empire, he then went on to defeat the Alans and Kasogians, nomads inhabiting the northern Caucasus. The Rus had a tendency of adopting nomadic customs, including clothes, titles, weapons and armor, but Sviatoslav seems to have taken a special interest in it, no doubt influenced by years of warring across the steppe. He traveled by horse, rested his head upon his saddle, and ate thin strips of meat roasted over a fire. Byzantine sources recount him dressed in a simple white shirt, with his hair cut in the nomadic fashion, a hairstyle later associated with the Cossacks. Sviatoslav had virtually become a nomad himself, and he would not settle after besting the Khazars. He was invited by the Byzantine emperor to fight the Bulgarians, and marched his army down to the Danube. After defeating the Bulgarians, he did something unexpected. He decided to stay. The region was fertile, and the Danube allowed for trade access deep into Central Europe. Rus and Greek chronicles alike present him as wishing to establish his capital there, but the Byzantines would have none of it. A barbarian so close to their capital was a major threat. They asked Sviatoslav to leave. He responded by crossing the border and besieged Adrianople, not far from Constantinople itself. Eventually he was surrounded and compelled to leave, but upon returning to Kiev by the Dnipro, he was ambushed by the Pechenegs and killed. According to legend, his skull was fashioned into a drinking cup. Sviatoslav had ruled for 28 years, most of whom he had spent on campaign. While absent, he ordained his sons to govern the dominion for him. The first son, Yaropolk, had been given control over Kiev. The second son, Oleg, ruled the Derevlians. The inhabitants of Novgorod demanded a prince of their own, so they were given Vladimir, born to a housekeeper, and accompanied by his uncle, Dobrynya. Indeed, Sviatoslav was the first documented ruler of Rus to have multiple sons, that we know of at least. The previous lack of multiple successors had led to remarkable stability, but it also meant that the Rus had never developed any traditions or methods of managing complicated successions. It wasn't so simple as the first son becomes the Prince of Kiev and becomes the ruler of Rus, because as previously explained, the Rus were almost nomadic and managed tribute collection and trade in a very collective manner. Indeed, the first blows were struck between rival hunting parties, out to acquire first for the tribute. Oleg executed the leader of the alleged trespassers, and Yaropolk responded by marching into his lands and slaying him. Vladimir shat his pants and fled overseas, most likely to Scandinavia. Foreign opportunists were quick to carpe diem. A certain Rogvolod, most likely a Norse Ragnvaldur, installed himself at Polotsk, Turi in a fort upon the Pripyat, giving it the name Turov. Other strongholds were established at the same time, their founders unknown. Several years later, Vladimir returned with a host of Norse warriors. He quickly regained control over Novgorod, where he bolstered his army with Slavs and Shuds. He proposed a marriage alliance to Rogvolod, but the warlord refused, so Vladimir had his city conquered, Rogvolod executed, and his daughter married by force. Next he marched upon Kiev, and managed to take the city by bloodless deception. Yaropolk had escaped, intending at first to muster an army among the Pechenegs, before deciding instead to visit his brother and try to negotiate. As he entered the stone palace, two Varangians closed the doors behind him. You can probably guess what happened next. Once there were many heirs, now there was one. One son, one Rus, one prince. Though his rule over Rus had been secured, Vladimir had no chance of getting comfy in his new throne. His Varangian warriors demanded payment, and after being unable to pay them quick enough, Vladimir sent them to Greece to seek their fortune with the emperor. His messengers likewise delivered a warning: beware the Varangians. Most likely the mercenaries had done a bit of smash and grab in the city of Kiev. Meanwhile, those still loyal to Yaropolk had gone renegade among the Pechenegs, and partook in frequent attacks upon Rus territory. Vladimir was a stranger in Kiev. He was a bastard born to a maid, grown up in distant Novgorod, and married to a foreign invader. His right to rule wasn't exactly a given, so the first order of business was to establish a sense of legitimacy. One method was by using religion. There isn't much known about Slavic paganism, except that it was largely disorganized, and it seems like Vladimir wanted to centralize the religion and set up a stately cult, in order to better control society. He regulated what gods were to be worshipped, by erecting a pantheon of chosen idols outside of his palace. The message was quite clear: these are the gods you should worship. A similar idol to Perun, the chief deity of his pantheon, was erected by his uncle Dobrynya in Novgorod, bridging the gap between the two cities. Worship was made mandatory and public. People would perform sacrifices to the palace idols, right for Vladimir to witness. According to the primary chronicle, Vladimir's cult even practiced human sacrifice. However, Vladimir soon found issues with his new cult. For one, people were reluctant to abandon their old practices for what was essentially an artificial religion. On the other hand, many of Vladimir's neighbors, including the Polish and Scandinavians, had converted to Christianity instead of reforming their cults. This was basically the new, hot and prestigious thing, and Vladimir was left in the dust. So he decided to send out delegates to the leaders of different religions, to find which one appealed to him the most, including Islam. It might seem ludicrous for the Rus to convert to Islam, especially when considering the proximity to Christianity, Constantinople in particular, but Islam was as close and as important a trade partner. Owing to various reasons, the flow of Arabic silver, which had led to the settling of Rus, was slowing down, and possibly in order to renew it, Vladimir and Dobrynya attempted to conquer the Volga Bulgars. Had they succeeded, they would have inherited a vast network of schools and mosques for them to easily adapt to this new religion. And though they did have some victories, they eventually decided to abandon the project. So they would settle for Christianity instead. They might have become Catholic. Indeed, Olga had been visited by delegates from the Germans, but their current ruler was a child, so it would have to be the Byzantines and Orthodox Christianity. Vladimir's conversion to Orthodoxy was quite, well, unorthodox. He decided to attack and occupy Byzantine Crimea and demanded the hand of the emperor's daughter. The Byzantines were currently fighting a civil war and were in need of mercenaries, so they decided to accept. Princess Anna was sent to Crimea, Vladi was baptized, and a Rus army sent as a relief force to Anatolia. It didn't prevent Vladi from using the ham hand. He plundered Crimean treasures, putting them in his own churches and palace. And he kidnapped priests, forcing them to preach among his own people. To his own people he was quite generous, handing out free food and beer to essentially buy their loyalty. He would also set about several construction projects, building churches, expanding the city of Kiev, and he even established new cities. The trade network southward was improved by founding new trade posts along the Dnipro, and by constructing forts to not only protect Kiev itself, but the river also. In these forts was stationed cavalry, who could quickly mount up in case of a Pecheneg intrusion. Connecting the forts were long lines of earthworks called the snake ramparts. A German eyewitness called them the most firm and lengthy fence. Vladimir had largely adopted Christianity as part of a general trend in Northern Europe. Another trend for these recently converted tribal monarchs was to institute their own coinage. Having coins with your own face on it was not only a matter of prestige, but also of control, reminding everyone of who was in charge. Indeed, Vladimir seems to have been the first Ruskayan ruler to start issuing his own coins, minted out of gold and silver by Byzantine standards and aesthetics. These coins have primarily been found in the Middle Dnieper region, but even as far as Gotland. Vladimir was the first and final ruler of Rus to issue high-quality coins. His successors would only proceed with silver coins, usually with a lower content of actual silver. By 1100, coins were replaced by silver ingots, and bartering for goods remained the most common means of exchange. Furs were a special currency. Several of Vladimir's coins were also engraved with a symbol of the ruling dynasty, the trident. It is now used as a national symbol for Ukraine, and the origins of it are not entirely certain. The earliest finding of this symbol I was able to find comes from the book The Early Slavs by Pavel M. Dolukhanov, where he describes a spinning wheel engraved with such a trident, found in the early Kiev settlement from the 6th or 7th centuries. But I have never been able to find any pictures of it. This finding would indicate that the trident is perhaps a very old symbol in the region and already native to the Slavs before the advent of Rus. It has been proposed that it is a nomadic symbol, or that it depicts an eagle, or even a ship. It is unknown when exactly the ruling dynasty began using this symbol. The bident as a symbol of Rus appears first in the form of graffiti, cut into coins from the late 9th century, the 870s and 80s. These coins have been found across the Baltic, Rus and even Khazaria. It has only been found a few times on other objects, including a flat piece of horn and several seals. The earliest finding of the bident on a seal comes from the reign of Sviatoslav, but since it has a cross on it, it is believed to have belonged to Olga, who was Christian, whereas Sviatoslav was an adamant pagan. Vladimir took his father's bident and modified it into the trident, and used it heavily as part of his legitimizing campaign. Aside from appearing on coins, its most prominent carving was in one of the stones of the Tithes Church, the first stone church ever erected in Kiev. The descendants of Vladimir would inherit his symbol and modify it slightly to become their own, until it was finally unrecognizable. Vladimir was unable to govern his vast empire all on his lonesome, and it appears as if the role of knyaz had become more stationary than previously. The old Rus was relatively peaceful, being surrounded by allies and isolated tribes, so the ruler was free to focus on trade and personally collecting tribute or leading his armies on foreign expeditions. But by the reign of Vladimir, the once friendly neighbors, the Volga Bulgars and now the Pechenegs, were enemies. Aside from keeping the empire defended, he had to worry about all of the administrative and state-building projects, so he simply couldn't travel around each of the cities, collecting tribute or annually visiting Byzantium. Of course, Vladimir, much like his father, was a bit of a shagger. It is unknown how many kids he had exactly, but he was diligent in involving his sons in the government. For example, one of his sons, Vyacheslav, born to a Czech concubine, was given control over Novgorod upon Dobrynia's passing. Rip Dobrynia, he seems to have been a real lad. Vladimir's project seems to have been to turn Rus into a massive family firm, with each of his sons and family members governing a territory for him. In this regard, Vladimir was and should be regarded as the founder of the so-called Rurikid dynasty. Rurik wasn't seen as important until the late Middle Ages. Before then, it was all about Vladimir. His idea was that his sons would be loyal to him, but perhaps he hadn't been such good of a father as he might have thought of himself. Indeed, trouble started even before his death. Around 1014, his son Sviatopolk, stationed in Turov, plotted against him, so Vladimir had him arrested. In 1015, Yaroslav of Novgorod refused to send tribute. Vladimir mustered an army and prepared to march out, but couldn't even get out of the palace before he fell ill and perished. All hell broke loose. The civil war which erupted was surprisingly well documented, not only by Ruskayan sources, but also external ones from Poland, Germany, even Iceland. However, like all of the Ruskayan civil wars, it was incredibly convoluted, being a massive family feud involving multiple members, each with their own interests, a veritable Game of Thrones or Crusader King session, involving intrigues, bloody battlefields, assassinations, twists and turns and setbacks and comebacks, and even two of the losers, Boris and Gleb, ascending into sainthood. It really cannot be covered in much detail within the scope of this video, which has already covered 3 centuries, but please tell me in the comments if you would like to see a video series on the Rus civil wars, and I might make one to test the waters, and if it performs well, perhaps make a series out of it. Owing to all of the bloodshed, I find this to be an excellent opportunity to talk a bit about the 11th century armies of medieval Russia. There was no regular national army. Instead, the ruler of each city and surrounding territory was surrounded by a small, standing retinue of professional warriors, the drushina. This word roughly translates to group of friends, and could range from a dozen to a few hundred, depending on the wealth and status of the prince in question. It might seem very small, but for the most part, it was all you needed. Violence, or rather the threat of violence, was the modus operandi for keeping yourself in power in medieval Russia. Most of the conflicts did in fact only involve these small groups of men, and some were even resolved by single combat. The show of arms was not only effective, but necessary, because the drushina were valuable. They had expensive training, equipment and skills, so you didn't want to waste them. So when push came to shove for actual battles and warfare, the armies were supplemented by town militias and auxiliaries from the local tribes and communities. These troops could only be raised during certain times and only seasonally, since they eventually had to return to their crafts or farms. So it was most common for rulers to employ foreign mercenaries, including nomads, Scandinavians, Germans, Poles and Hungarians. These groups could be recruited in turn for payment or plunder, or as part of political alliances and promises. Indeed, medieval Rus was far from insular, but closely connected to the rest of Europe. Marriages were had with princesses from Poland, Germany, Sweden, even France and England. Eastern Europe was nothing strange or distant or alien. It was part of the medieval European world. So the armies could be quite diverse. At Lyubech in 1015, Sviatopolk's army of Pechenegs fought against Yaroslav's army of Norsemen. Paying for these mercenaries could become a problem, as happened previously with Vladimir. Yaroslav had to implement a special tax in Novgorod to pay for his Varangian mercenaries. Some soldiers were even handed out land and used as settlers to found new settlements. Some of these soldier settlers were even prisoners of war. In 1026, peace was finally signed between Mstislav and Yaroslav, who split the kingdom of Rus between them. Interestingly, Mstislav seemed interested in moving the capital from Kiev to Chernihiv, but his project wasn't to be. He died in 1036 on a hunting trip. Yaroslav inherited his entire territory and became the sole ruler, autocrat, Samovlastets of Rus. This makes it necessary to discuss the actual title of the ruling princess. As mentioned early on in the video, the first ever documented ruler of the Rus was the so-called Kievan Rus, mentioned at several points in the early 9th century. In the succeeding centuries, it seems as though the title of Kievan became less formal and perhaps ceremonial instead, but it appears in multiple, very different sources. Multiple Muslim authors mention a Kievan Rus. In the 1040s, the Metropolitan of Kiev referred to both Vladimir and Sviatoslav as Kievan. Most interesting is perhaps a prayer carved into the interior wall of the Church of Saint Sophia. It reads, Spasi, Gospodi, Kagane nashego. Please, Lord, save our Kievan. So why did the rulers of Rus call themselves Kievan? Many ideas have been proposed. Perhaps it was part of the Rus usurping of the Khazars' power. Perhaps it had been bestowed or borrowed from the Khazars, or maybe it was even used as a declaration of independence. Of note is that the Kievan appears very rarely in Western sources, and never in Byzantine ones, in which the heads of the Rus state are called archon, meaning ruler. The Rus seem to have been content with this title, at least early on, as it appears on princely seals in the 11th and early 12th centuries, when Greek influence was the strongest in Rus culture. There is even a single piece of graffiti where Yaroslav is referred to as Tsar, but this title does not appear to have been widespread at this point, and never officially adopted. The nominal title for the ruler was Knyaz, usually translated as prince into English, which becomes appropriate when considering Rus essentially as a giant family business. In the golden age of Rus, between the reign of Vladimir until about 1132, there wasn't really any formalized government. Instead, government was constructed on an ad hoc basis between the ruler, his retinue, and his family members. Positions were not as important as relationships. In historical work we often find the title of Grand Prince, and though the epithet of Great was used in the 11th century and before, it was more so a title akin to Alexander or Constantine the Great. It wasn't until the 1190s that Knyaz Vsevolod of Vladimir Zustal began using the title of Veliki Knyaz, Great Prince. But by this point, Rus had become so fragmentary as to make it meaningless. The old relations had broken down, and instead you had to rely on laws and titles to claim any sort of power. And it didn't work. With the realm secured and the Pechenegs defeated, Yaroslav began a massive state-building project. Byzantium was the obvious source of influence, and the Rus sought to imitate them in almost all regards. He set about expanding and fortifying the city of Kiev, and constructed a number of churches, most impressive being Saint Sophia, which would even have been noteworthy in Nova Roma. Byzantine-style works were constructed by Byzantine architects using Byzantine materials. Inscriptions were in Greek, not Slavonic. In the royal palace, one could look upon painted scenes of the Hippodrome, which very few Russians would ever have the honor of witnessing. Rus had truly become one with the Christian world. It is then incredibly strange that in 1043, when Saint Sophia was still being built, Yaroslav mustered a fleet carrying 10,000 troops and attacked Constantinople. According to the Greeks, a prominent Rus had been killed in a marketplace altercation in the capital, but certainly this wasn't cause for an attack of this caliber. The reasons why are up to speculation. Perhaps it was simply Yaroslav living up to the long tradition of his predecessors attacking the city of God. Perhaps he wanted respect from Constantinople and for them to regard him as an equal. The war was short and poorly documented, with little gained in terms of spoils. It was over shortly thereafter, and peaceful relations resumed. Yaroslav did of course continue his father's project of christening the country, a task easier said than done, especially the farther away you went from the extravagant churches of the middle Dnipro. In Rostov, hostile locals persecuted their bishops. Pagan priests called Volchev held a lot of authority and would often challenge the authority of local princes. It wouldn't be until several centuries later that the average peasant would become a pious Christian, much to the eye of the preachers, especially when regarding ritual and sexual purity. Metropolitan John II wrote in the 1080s how Only boyars and princes get married with proper ceremony and blessing, while the common people do not. That the common people take wives as if by abduction, with much leaping and dancing and hooting. Though law had obviously existed before the reign of Yaroslav, he is perhaps most famous for issuing the first written legal code, the so-called Russkaya Pravda. It was continuously adapted over the centuries to hold eventually 43 articles, but the first 18 drafted by Yaroslav concerned dealing with killings, injuries, and the recovery of property. Article 1 allows for the revenge killing by a close relative, brother, father, son or nephew, or a payment of 40 grivnas. Articles 2 to 10 specify sums to be paid for assault or physical injuries. For example, 12 grivnas are to be paid if someone strikes you with a sword or goblet. My favorite is the 12 grivnas to be paid for injuring someone's beard. Article 11 to 18 deal with procedures and payments for the violation of property, how to recover an escaped slave, payment for stealing a horse, etc. Comparisons have been drawn between Scandinavian laws and the Pravda, both of which handle punishment by payment and legalized killings in a similar manner. Owing to its practical nature, the Pravda was written in vernacular instead of Church Slavonic. In Rus, there were essentially two official languages, East Slavonic and Church Slavonic. The latter emerged in 9th century Moravia for the sake of translating biblical texts into Slavic. Use of this language in Rus even predated Christianization, with samples including this name or ingredient inscribed into an earthen pot. But the alphabet used by the Rus was Cyrillic, which seemingly emerged in Bulgaria after Church Slavonic was imported there from Moravia. Aside from a few short examples, it is not certain how widespread literacy was in pre-Christian Rus. It might simply have been a novelty. The primary medium for written messages was birch bark, and findings of birch bark letters are especially common from medieval Novgorod. Most well known and charming come from Anfim, a boy who lived in 13th century Novgorod. He scrawled his homework and made various drawings on pieces of birch bark. But I think the earliest findings of birch bark letters come from the 11th century and not earlier. The language of Church Slavonic, though used in the high culture, was not the language of the dirty peasant. The regular person spoke East Slavonic, and though the languages shared a grammatical structure and vocabulary, Church Slavonic was more complicated and contained a lot of concepts which would have been alien to the average layman. Of interesting note is that West Slavonic was the language around Novgorod, seemingly inherited from Wendish immigrants. There is also the matter of Norse language. There are a handful of findings from the 9th and 10th centuries bearing runic inscriptions. Usually these are incantations carved into wood or jewelry, many of which have been made in Scandinavia and imported. There is also some evidence pointing to Norse being the spoken language of the upper class in the 10th century. In the Byzantine text, the Administrando Imperio, the names of different places are both given in the language of the Slavs, as they called it, and the language of the Rus. Though the text contains Greek transliterations of the original words, linguists have been able to decipher the source words in the original Slavic and Norse languages. For example, the second barrage of the Dnipro Rapids was called Ostrovurni Prach in the Slavic language and Ulvorsi in the Rus. These words appear to be Ostrovinic Prachu in Slavic and Holmfors in Norse, both meaning island waterfall. Most interesting is the one called Neafit in Slavic and Ifor in Rus, which are virtually identical to the original words. The Norse name of the rapid, Eifor, even appears on a Gotlandic runestone. Shortly before passing away in 1054, Yaroslav assigned separate princedoms to his sons. Izyaslav received Kiev and Novgorod, Sviatoslav Chernyahiv, Vsevolod, Peryaslav, Vyacheslav, Smolensk, and Igor, Vladimir Volhynia. With this arrangement, Yaroslav hoped to avoid the bloody free-for-all which had erupted upon the death of his own father, and his father before him. And to some extent it worked, with the brothers managing to settle issues of inheritance and tribute on an individual level. They even cooperated in campaigning against the nomadic Ogush in 1060. But trouble was brewing beneath the surface. A rivalry between Novgorod and Polotsk soon blossomed into skirmishes, ransackings, and finally a near-endless streak of civil war and familicide between the sons of Yaroslav. At the same time, a new threat emerged in 1061. Riding out of the eastern steppe, the Cumans, known as Polovtsein Rus, trampled the Pechenegs and occupied the southern steppe. 1061 marked their first attack on Rus territory, and they would remain a constant threat until the Mongol invasion in 1237. Rus had always been a maritime empire, controlled by the riverways, its warriors primarily fighting by boat. But in the mid-10th century, the warriors would begin a shift away from boats and more towards cavalry. Horses needed pastures and warriors needed estates, so as cavalry became increasingly prominent in the second millennium, the princes and boyars began drifting away from the towns and into the countryside. They began to organize estates and extracted rent from neighboring communities. Whilst they had previously been personally involved in the trade network, collecting tribute and traveling themselves to Constantinople, they now began to withdraw from direct involvement and focused instead on facilitating and controlling commerce. Thus began a sort of feudalization, a clear separation between warriors, peasants, and merchants. When the sons of Yaroslav finally died, the surviving brothers and nephews were uncertain on how to handle succession, and conflict broke out between them as well. In 1097, the surviving family members met at a conference in Lyubech and agreed upon the prevailing succession of father to son, then older brother to younger brother. But it ultimately proved unable to prevent further bloodshed. Internal conflicts continued until 1113, when Vladimir Monomakh, the grandson of Yaroslav, would assume the throne and guide the Kievan state into a sort of revival. The late 11th century also saw a different shift in the cultural sphere, which would persist for the rest of the Middle Ages. Though the late 10th and early 11th century had essentially been dedicated to Christianizing and Greekifying the Rus culture, the late 11th century became increasingly dedicated to producing a more domestic and unique identity. Indeed, Rus had never been part of the Hellenic world or Roman Empire, so it could only draw so much from its Byzantine influence outside of the Bible. This new wave of Russian literature included the writing of chronicles, most prominent being the primary chronicle, which Monomakh himself was probably involved in. The most notable medieval Russian text is probably the Lay of the Host of Igor, a poetic account of the unsuccessful campaign against the Cumans in 1185. The earliest surviving remnant of this text can be dated to the 15th century. Aside from these more epic projects, domestic literature included folk songs, riddles, and fairy tales. But even though local culture developed, the regions shared a common identity and wouldn't develop separately until after the fall of the Kievan Rus. Most of Monomach's reign was spent at war. He fought in Livonia, Finland, Volga Bulgaria, the Danube, repulsing Poles, Hungarians, and of course the Cumans, whom he defeated in 1111 at Salnitsa. His testament speaks of 83 major campaigns, and also of the killing of 200 Cuman princes. According to tradition, Cuman mothers would use his name to scare their children. Aside from these bloody deeds, he was an organizer and administrator, constructing several new towns, and he implemented social legislation intended to help the poor, especially debtors. And despite all of the troubles, the economy in the city of Kiev was booming. Control over local and international trade led to strong markets, rapidly growing urban crafts, and the construction of extravagant public monuments, including new churches. The citizenry of Kiev, and indeed of every town, exercised a lot of power, and the ruling prince would often be dependent on their approval for his legitimacy. The popular assembly, called Veche, could depose and appoint a prince if they so desired. There wasn't any formalized parliament. Just like the government structure, it was ad hoc, and ruled by a collective willpower. Monomakh found a diplomatic solution to the Cuman problem when he married two of his sons to Cuman princesses. More importantly, a buffer zone had been created between Rus and the Cumans, consisting of allied and semi-sedentary Cuman frontiersmen, who had sworn allegiance to Rus. Their bordermen were known as Black Caps, or Chernye and were essential for the protection of the southern trade route. Monomakh died in 1125 and was succeeded by his son, Mstislav. Despite only ruling for 7 years, Mstislav was noted as an energetic and quite brilliant ruler. Interestingly, his mother was an Anglo-Saxon daughter of King Harold, who was defeated by William the Conqueror in 1066. Thus, Mstislav is often called Harold in Norse sagas, in which he is often featured. Like his father, he built multiple churches in both Kiev and Novgorod, but spent most of his short reign at war. He perished in 1132, aged 55. The bells of his funeral would also mark the final toll for a unified Rus. Many reasons have been given as to the fall of the Kievan Rus. What is usually discussed are the issues of succession and growing rivalries between the interrelated families, and the decline of the river trade network. Indeed, when the primary Chronicle was written, it is said that there was a route going between the Varangians to the Greeks, in the past tense. The route was no longer there. This isn't exactly true. You could of course get items from Byzantium to Novgorod and across the Baltic, but it had become more difficult. This was caused by the individual territories of Rus becoming more independent, as a result of the dynastic disputes of the princes ruling them, and the decline of the trade network itself. The route was constantly under threat by civil war, not to mention the Cumans blocking and harassing the southern way as they pleased. Each land had to tailor its own unique solution to its own unique problems. The city of Galich, situated in what is now western Ukraine, sat upon the intersection of the trade routes to the west and to Byzantium and Kiev. But it was safer from the nomads, and was thus able to develop independently from Kiev and became quite the upstart. However, it also had to worry about the Hungarians. The city of Novgorod became commercially independent from the south when it started to produce cheap domestic metallurgy, usually knives and axes, traded for furs in the sparsely populated north. These furs were then exported across the Baltic, to Scandinavia, Germany, even France and England. This fur market would remain prominent until a rival market was opened up in the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries. One of Novgorod's rivals were the Volga Bulgars, who desired both northern furs and trade from the Caspian, but didn't want either of the trade partners to trade with the other. This often resulted in conflict, and a need to mediate between these very different worlds. This peculiar dynamic gave rise to the territories of Rostov and Vladimir Zustal, who essentially functioned as an armed police force between Novgorod and the Bulgars, and profiting from it in turn. In a similar but more peaceful fashion, the city of Smolensk became the literal middleman between the north and south, as any traders upon the river had to portage their boats over Smolensk territory. But traveling through Smolensk was no longer the only option. An old tributary known as the Viatici had long resisted assimilation into Rus, refusing to abandon their pagan ideals, and often attacking those seeking tribute in their lands. But the arrival of profitable trade and travelers passing through their lands made the Viatici more receptible. By the mid-12th century, a foreign prince could travel through their land without the old sense of danger. This gave rise to new trading settlements, including Serena, Tarusa, and Moskva, more well known in English as Moscow. Schöner und geheimnisvoll. However, the rise of alternate trade routes and local interest did not mean a decline of the middle Dnipro and Kiev itself. The mother of Rus cities had simply lost its monopoly, but it was still incredibly rich, home to affluent merchants and craftsmen. The decline of a unified Rus did not come from some explosive, dramatic event, but was rather an organic and probably quite healthy process. It was, after all, a massive country, and each of the lands needed to tend to their own unique interests. Rostov and Zustal had to contend with the Novgorodians and Bulgars. Galich needed to strike a balance between the Byzantines and Hungarians, Chernihiv with the Viatici and Cumans, and so on. A single government based in Kiev could simply not juggle between all of these different interests, let alone its own, which Kiev had so previously tried. Indeed, the independence of the lands led to local prosperity, The lands became more affluent, resulting in the founding of public structures and the rise of local culture and religion. At the same time, these territories weren't insular, but just as they were independent, they were interlinked by commerce. The Monomachs had made the best efforts to unite the cities under a more closely knit family, but upon the death of Mstislav in 1132, the dynasty descended once more into disputes and civil war. In 1169, Prince Andrei of Vladimir Zustal stormed and ransacked the city of Kiev. But instead of making it the seat of his power as previous princes had done, Andrei gave the throne to his brother, Gleb, essentially making Kiev a vassal. Andrei continued to govern from Vladimir, and this event marked the end of Kiev as the capital of a unified state. The final nail in the coffin was the Mongol invasion of 1240, when Kiev was taken by Batu Khan and ransacked. The city had since been weakened by multiple assaults in the preceding decades. It is easy to say that Rus might have been able to repel the Mongols had the dynasty worked together like their grandfathers, an idea which is, of course, preposterous. The dynasty had never been unified, but at the same time, it had always been. Whilst the brothers and uncles and cousins had constantly been fighting each other, their lands had never been conquered by any of the horse nomads. They had survived the Khazars, Pechenegs and Cumans. The Mongols were the exception, as they had been so many times before. Could the Rus really be blamed for falling to the force that conquered China and Persia? Not really. Furthermore, Kiev and its vicinity had been a forested region in ancient days, but suffered from deforestation, both natural and man-made, in the decades leading up to the Mongol invasion. This bereaved the land of a natural barrier, which had previously shielded it against the horse nomads. The period between the fall of the Kievan Rus and reunification of Rus by Moscow has been called the appanage. Appanage refers to the separate holding of an individual prince. The splitting of the state led to the development of separate languages and identities, which would eventually become the modern Belarusian, Russian and Ukrainian identities. The appanage states paid tribute to the Mongol Khans of the Golden Horde, and were frequently subject to foreign invasions from German crusaders, Sweden and Lithuania, which would eventually conquer much of Rus and form a sort of hybrid Lithuanian-Rus kingdom. Most notable to outsiders, the region would lose its international status. Only Novgorod would retain close-ish connections to the west, but Rus as a whole would become something foreign, isolated. Constantinople fell to the Crusaders in 1204, further ruining the southern connection. The Mongol conquest and fall of the Kievan Rus truly marked a shift in Eastern civilization, changing its character into something entirely different from what it was previously, and something whose effects we can still witness to this day. I hope you enjoyed this video on the Kievan Rus, and that it gave you a better understanding of medieval Russia. This video was definitely not easy to make, and required not only a lot of time to research, but also to process a lot of the material. All of my sources are listed in the video description, but it also draws from my previous episodes and the knowledge accumulated from their sources. There are still a few more videos to be made on Rus before I move on to other parts of the Baltic. YouTube is my full-time job, and it's a steady income which allows me to continue producing these videos. If you want to continue seeing them, please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. If only 1,000 of my regular viewers would donate $1 each a month, it would pretty much guarantee the channel's permanency. I also have a second channel called Golden Gunpowder, which covers the golden age of piracy. Give it a look if you're interested, and I'll be seeing you soon.